In the first episode, Debbie Bazina from Umtree provided an excellent overview of V2X technology and presented research which demonstrated the effectiveness of the various V2X applications. She also shared results of a predictive analysis showing that had we started deploying V2X in 2019, we could be saving more than 3,100 lives in the first 5 years. Also, Bob Krieg from NHTSA discussed the agency's study that examined the impact of interference from the unlicensed Wi-Fi devices onto the 30 megahertz spectrum. The findings of that study, as well as other relevant research, point to the critical consequence of the FCC's decision earlier this year to shrink the safety spectrum by 60%. This FCC rule threatens the basic viability of V2X in the United States. In today's episode, we will examine the impact of these regulatory actions and discuss differing rules and positions by the FCC and DOT and NHTSA. Then we will evaluate the current state of V2X deployment in the United States as a result of the FCC's rule. Finally, we will discuss V2X deployment around the world and start exploring the industry perspective. My first guest today is Ken Leonard. Ken is the director of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Intelligent Transportation Systems Joint Program Office. He is a recognized leader in the field of intelligent transportation systems. Prior to joining the ITS Joint Program Office, Ken held multiple positions across the federal government, including time at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and the FAA. He also has vast private sector experience. Ken is a graduate of the George Washington University School of Public and International Affairs, where he earned a bachelor's degree in international economics. Additionally, he has completed graduate-level studies in economics and finance. Ken, welcome and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to the NTSB.
Great, Ken. Well, let's just jump right in. Let's start with some background, if you don't mind. As the head of the Department of Transportation's ITS Joint Program Office, can you discuss the role that your office has in implementing connected vehicle technology? And is that role limited to infrastructure or is it much broader?
Well, sure. You may not be aware of this, but the JPO, the ITS Joint Program Office, is 30 years old this year. It's an office that was born out of the realization that the microchip, computers, sensors, and information communications technology were the future of everything, including transportation. Now, the JPO is responsible for leading and coordinating research, development, testing, piloting, deploying, professional capacity building, and technology transfer of intelligent transportation systems. Over 30 years, the Joint Program Office managed a broad portfolio that included several generations of ITS, from enhancing 911, dynamic message signs, red light cameras, hot lanes, and now artificial intelligence, smart cities, automated vehicles, and cybersecurity. We plan and coordinate the Secretary's ITS portfolio, working across all modes and in collaboration with other government agencies and outside stakeholders. Our work on connected vehicle technology is vitally important and included making a determination about what technologies could achieve DOT's goals and about establishing a complete connected vehicle ecosystem. We've worked with FRA on rail crossing issues in connected vehicles, MARAD and FMCSA applying it to port and freight drayage applications, FTA on transit bus applications and pedestrian safety from connected vehicles, NHTSA on vehicle equipage, federal highways on infrastructure and truck platooning, even had conversations with the FAA and the St. Lawrence Seaway about potential drone and shipping applications of connected vehicles. I don't think there's a transportation mode, except perhaps commercial space, that wouldn't benefit from the right connected vehicle environment.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Based on the projects that your office supported, can you expand on the readiness of the technology for deployment, specifically for imminent crash prevention applications?
Well, I think the key word in your question is readiness. And I think that has different meanings in different industries. In the tech sector, the computer and software industry, putting a technology out into the hands of consumers and dealing with crashes may be a viable approach, because few people die or get injured from a dropped cell phone call. Not so in transportation, because readiness isn't about a beta version. Readiness means you can stake your life and the lives of millions of people on it. The department has completed sufficient research on dedicated short-range communication, DSRC, an 802.11 based Wi-Fi based protocol, and NHTSA made a decision that the technology was mature enough to proceed with a rulemaking and launch that process over 5 years ago, knowing that there was at least one fully tested mature technology for vehicle everything, V2X as we call it. And voluntary DSRC deployments began back then, even ahead of OMB action on the NHTSA rule. Several years later, at the time of the FCC NPRM, the DOT, our state and local partners have deployed over 70 V2X deployments, and 100 plus deployments were moving through planning stages in over 25 states. Prior to the FCC action, the safety band usage had seen over 200% growth in a few years.
Great. Considering your perspective on the readiness of the technology, I have a series of questions pertaining to the FCC's actions this year and the position of your office and DOT more generally. And I know you have been vocal about preserving the 75 megahertz safety spectrum. In our first episode, we discussed NHTSA's research on the impact of interference on V2X communication within the 30 megahertz spectrum. Based on that discussion, we came to question the basic viability of V2X in the wake of the FCC's recent rule. What are your views on that research, and would the interference have the same impact on the communication between LTE to V2X devices?
Well, first, let me say, I think connected vehicles are foundation, and you're asking a critical question for everyone concerned about effective V2X deployment, regardless of the technology they favor. We conducted a very quick and early look at interference when the FCC first telegraphed the idea of limiting safety to 30 megahertz. The preliminary look by our DOT spectrum engineers indicated significant interference and impingement of function, especially for collision avoidance, was likely. I'm concerned that the FCC doesn't seem to have conducted any testing on this issue at all, nor heeded our results. Now, scientific methods, data, and evidence are central to the development and improvement of sound policies, safe and reliable technology, and to the delivery of solid programs that have enduring outcomes. We believe important decisions like this have to be guided by well-established scientific processes and methods that ensure honesty, accuracy, objectivity, clarity, replicability, transparency, and peer review, not marketing hype. We acquired 250 commercial cellular V2X devices to conduct testing and cellular V2X testing in laboratories at Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, in a field test bed, and at Tampa, Florida, where we have a connected vehicle pilot site. The teams initiated the data analysis phase after accumulating 2 terabytes of data during the test phase that ended in September. The data analysis phase anticipates to produce results later this year. This testing is vital to begin characterizing how cellular V2X might perform, its function of vehicle and infrastructure deployment for collision avoidance, mobility, and efficiency applications, and whether it's suitable for intelligent transportation capabilities in the 5.9 band as structured by the FCC. This will help us get a better understanding of interference resulting from the FCC band plan.
Great, thank you for that. In our first episode, we also discussed the limited possibilities of the 30 megahertz spectrum. I'll also ask you, are advanced V2X applications possible within the 30 megahertz, such as shared perception with future automated vehicles?
Well, this is a big concern. Low latency connectivity is essential for automation concepts such as truck platooning. We haven't yet seen the evidence that FCC's plan will work for connected vehicle technology, let alone automated vehicles.
Great. Well, in your opinion, which option should we be pursuing to regain the viability of V2X? Would it be retrieving the lost bandwidth, or at least part of it, or obtaining channels from another part of the spectrum, or ensuring the FCC enforces its rules regarding interference?
Well, I have to say, a lot of thought went into putting connected vehicle technologies in the 5.9 bandwidth. It's very well suited to the short-range applications that are necessary for collision avoidance. But we have to pursue every option available to deploy V2X technology. Those options have to deploy a technology that's effective. This means any chosen technology and band plan have to work to prioritize safety over other applications. The technology has to be interoperable. This means between all manufacturers, all states, all modes, all applications. It has to be efficient. This means it has to use the bandwidth in a manner that's efficient and achieves the desired outcome. It has to be affordable. And this means the lowest cost to consumers, owners, and operators and taxpayers. No consumer should be priced out of safety using V2X. And finally, it has to be available. This means it has to be ubiquitous, from the city center to the streets, or to rural roads and cornfields. Collision avoidance doesn't have to depend on infrastructure.
Great, thank you for that, Ken. We view V2X, and specifically vehicle-to-vehicles, as a life-saving technology that can address the limitations of current vehicle sensor-based collision avoidance technology. You have stated that V2X technology is ready to save lives today, and in our first episode, Debbie Bazina from Umtree agreed. However, the regulatory actions this year, as well as previous inaction, have created significant challenges to the widespread deployment of V2X technology. Let's discuss what happened and what can be done to realize the safety benefit of this life-saving technology. NHTSA released an NPRM in January 2017 to mandate DSRC technology in all passenger vehicles. The NTSB supported the proposal while expressing concerns for excluding heavy vehicles. Nearly 5 years later today, what is the status of the proposed rulemaking?
Well, first, let me say that yes, I agree with Debbie Bazina's point. The U.S. was on a course to deploy a proven, effective collision avoidance, mobility enhancing, environmentally efficient, connected vehicle system that could add an increased level of safety and overcome many of the limitations of current onboard safety systems. Second, while the DOT proposed rule covered light vehicles, a lot of work has been done with heavy vehicles as well, including trucks and buses. State and local deployments have begun. OEMs were generally in consensus with varying degrees of enthusiasm when NHTSA published an ANPRM in 2017, and even when the final rule was submitted to OMB. That rule is still over there today, and it's been a few years, and I think while it's over there, I think it would have to be looked at closely to update that rule with some of the things we've learned in the last 4 years of research and development.
Sure, I understand that. Technology has changed in just a few years, hasn't it?
Yes, indeed.
I would like to talk about mandates and different aspects of its application and feasibility. So here's my two-pronged question for you. In your opinion, is a mandate necessary for broad deployment of CV technology? And if so, how would it be applied considering that NHTSA's NPRM from 2017 dramatically differs from the FCC's final and proposed rulemakings earlier this year?
Well, I probably should have started even with the last question by saying that my office isn't a regulatory office, we're a research office. And we've done a lot of research, approaching $1 billion to develop the connected vehicle ecosystem behind the proposed NHTSA rule and the connected vehicle ecosystem. Mandates are always a tough question, and regulation is not always viewed as an acceptable approach. At least in the last administration, it was not an approach that DOT could move forward with. Now, safe and efficient transportation is foundational. It's fundamental to a well-functioning economy and society. The Department of Transportation's mission is aimed at ensuring safe and efficient passage for travelers, goods throughout the nation. Safety is our highest priority, and the department balances all those decisions appropriately against competing public interests. I mentioned earlier that our state and local partners have voluntarily participated in over 70 V2X deployments and had those additional deployments in the planning stage. All that happened even in the absence of a mandate. I'll add too that General Motors introduced the technology into their high-end Cadillac back in 2017, and Toyota announced in 2018 that they'd deploy in all their vehicles by this year, 2021. Unfortunately, FCC's response to those overtures was to actively discourage those deployments while simultaneously complaining about the lack of vehicle deployment. So deployment can happen on a voluntary basis here in the US and elsewhere. A mandate sometimes simplifies things and creates a level playing field, but that's a tougher policy decision that I'll leave to the regulators.
Thank you for that, Ken. I know there was a lot to those two questions there. Let's go back to the FCC's rule and how it was developed. Was there any direct communication between the FCC and DOT or NHTSA prior to the FCC finalizing the ruling that shrunk the safety spectrum?
Well, for many years, US DOTs communicated our safety position to FCC, and we backed it up with research. We understand the importance that broadband plays in developing our nation's economy. Certainly, we're using it today to conduct this interview. We realize that unlicensed Wi-Fi is an important part of expanding broadband. However, in 2020, the Wi-Fi industry received an additional 1,200 megahertz, nearly tripling the available Wi-Fi. The entire safety band was only 75 megahertz. And now that Wi-Fi has been granted over half of that 75 megahertz, plus the additional 1,200, it would seem that they have an ample amount for broadband and unlicensed applications.
Great. How about the DOT's position, or at least the position of your office, on the FCC's current proposed rulemaking to allocate the remaining 30 megahertz spectrum for the use of only LTE to V2X devices and ceasing the use of DSRC?
Well, again, we're very concerned. The 75 megahertz is a small slice of the spectrum, but it has tremendous impact on ITS and transportation safety for the nation, particularly when employed for V2X communications. FCC's action removing 60% of the safety band will have certain impacts. One, it's halted ongoing road safety deployments and applications worth billions of dollars. It's impeding the flow of commerce on our nation's roadways in sites that we already have deployed on important freight corridors. It jeopardizes America's standing as a global leader in vehicle safety and mobility. And I believe it's going to have a future impact on the safe rollout of automated vehicles on our roadways. And for all those reasons, we're concerned.
Absolutely. These FCC actions clearly have an enormous impact on transportation safety, including the FCC determining which technology should be used for V2X. Considering that the DOT opposes these unilateral FCC actions, the optics are bad. Not only does it look bad that the FCC is making these decisions instead of DOT, but those decisions have severe negative impact on transportation safety. How can this disagreement be resolved so that the critical decisions regarding these transportation safety issues are made by a transportation safety agency?
Well, the FCC has responsibility and authority to set aside spectrum for specific uses. Our position is that the FCC should make good choices that serve the public interest. It's with this in mind that we believe the FCC should turn to the US DOT as the expert in transportation safety to work with our industry, experts, and to determine which technology is best suited for vehicle to everything communications. The department is technology neutral, but not performance neutral. good public policy should prioritize the safety of the greatest number of Americans using technology that's proven and available today, while continuously evaluating technology that may enhance road safety in the future. V2X communications using 5.9 gigahertz safety band hold tremendous promise to enhance road safety due to the capabilities that other safety technologies do not possess. To prevent crashes in real time, two-way low latency data exchange is required among vehicles, between vehicles in the roadside infrastructure, and between vehicles and devices used by pedestrians and other vulnerable road users. V2X communications technology is the only technology with this capability available today and into the near future. This capability includes the ability to detect approaching objects outside the line of sight, including behind buildings, large trucks, and other obstructions and obstacles. The US DOT is committed to working, to testing, and to understanding the usability of 30 megahertz and further understanding the safety performance of the radio technology chosen by the FCC. We're testing the efficacy of cellular V2X in crash avoidance partnerships with the National Telecommunications Information Administration, NTIA, which is a part of the Department of Commerce. We want to see whether cellular V2X can be proven to work reliably from a safety perspective. We're just not there yet. We believe in letting the science and facts determine the outcome. I mentioned earlier that enduring outcomes are based in facts. FCC's work should be guided by well-established scientific methods to make a decision on transportation safety and a technology that could impact 6 million crashes, 3 million injuries, and nearly 40,000 deaths annually. Even the FCC noted back in their report and order back in 2004 that it is paramount that such communications be protected from interference given the consequences to the traveling public should any one of these safety applications fail due to unacceptable error rates or delays. I think that a joint review of the data rather than unilateral action would give the nation and the public the outcome they want.
These obstacles that we are currently facing appear entirely self-made. I want to take a quick look outward and explore whether other regions around the world are facing the same obstacles. In Europe, Volkswagen has had the Golf equipped with the V2X capability since 2019, and the ID.3, the electric hatchback, equipped with V2X since its introduction in 2020. And these are the two highest volume vehicle models in Europe. Can you briefly describe the safety spectrum situation in Europe and why it appears that Europe is moving forward with wide V2X deployment?
Sure, and you're right. Since 2019, VW has been deploying DSRC, what they call G5, in one of their most popular models. That model usually sells about 500,000 vehicles a year. I understand during the pandemic, sales were a little off in Europe, but they've since picked up and recovered. Now, they're using a viable technology. It's using globally accepted standards on 802.11. And I'll add that they're doing it without a mandate. I commend the Europeans for moving out with technology that they have confidence in and that doesn't foreclose options if transportation safety applications can migrate to 5G or other technologies in the future. It's a smart move forward. Many in the ITS community believe that we should follow the examples of our European communities or of our European colleagues who are increasing and not shrinking ITS spectrum. And we're concerned, and they're concerned, that there may not be enough to field not just cooperative and connected vehicles and infrastructure, but also automated vehicles in the future. The Auto Alliance in the US is committed to accelerating vehicle-based deployments if the 5.9 band is given 75 megahertz back. They've made an offer to the nation to successfully deploy up to 5 million vehicles.
Wow, that's very informative. That's about all the questions I have for you and with our discussion today. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Sure. I guess to me, it all boils down to ITS technology, if deployed now for connected vehicles, can reduce crashes, save lives, and increase mobility and efficiency. But to achieve that, good public policy matters, good governance matters, and facts matters. And here's what the facts tell us. Connected vehicles and rigorously tested and validated technologies like DSRC are transformative, tested, demonstrated, proven. They work and you can bet your life on them. Vehicle to everything technology has enormous potential to prevent crashes and save lives on our roads. Today, we're able to make significant advances in safety and mobility, improve transportation system operations using existing cooperative technologies, and reduce taxpayer burden. V2X technologies give us this opportunity. We need this safety deployment now, not later.
Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to inform us and make us a little more intelligent on this matter. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I don't think there's a more important issue to discuss.
My second guest is Laura Chace. Laura is the president and CEO of ITS America. Prior to serving in that capacity, she was the association's chief operating officer. In her role, she promotes policies that advance the development and safe deployment of intelligent transportation technologies throughout the United States. Laura's vast experience includes leadership positions at previous trade associations such as American Trucking Association, as well as roles at the Department of Justice and the White House. Laura, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me for this very important conversation.
Absolutely. As we start our conversation, it would be useful to understand the role of ITS America. Your membership includes many state DOTs and municipalities, but also various vehicle manufacturers, tech, and telecommunication companies. With such diverse membership, one would expect varied and sometimes opposing interests. Can you provide us a brief background of the organization and its members, and also discuss a couple of projects, whether with state DOTs or vehicle manufacturers or Tier 1 vendors?
Absolutely. So ITS America represents public and private stakeholders across the entire transportation industry who all come together to support the research, development, and deployment of technology on our transportation system to make it safer, greener, and smarter. As you said, we have a very diverse membership. We have, as you mentioned, state DOTs, we have city DOTs, transit, MPOs, the breadth of the private sector, also academics and research. This does make for a robust policy process, and we do pride ourselves on coming to consensus on positions. And we've been able to do so successfully, even on very difficult issues, such as V2X or automated vehicles, mobility on demand, and equity are some examples. The power and the benefit of this, though, I will say, is that because we do represent the diversity of the entire transportation industry, when we do come to consensus on a position, it has significant value for policymakers because we're not representing just one single interest. Some of the issues that we focus on, in addition, of course, to V2X, are automated vehicles, I mentioned, sustainability and resiliency, smart infrastructure, mobility on demand, and emerging technologies. So we have a pretty broad scope of interests and members. In terms of V2X, though, which is one of our core issues and always has been, I think it's really important to sort of remember ITS America's position in this space. So we were, 2 decades or more ago, the organization that petitioned the FCC to actually provide this spectrum for ITS services in the first place. At the time, we argued that designating the spectrum for V2X would be an important prioritization of public safety and transportation. And we stand by that argument and that designation today. As you mentioned, we have many members who are actually deploying and testing these technologies. It's not theoretical. They're doing so. We have states like Georgia, Michigan, Utah, and others, cities like New York City, and automakers like Ford, GM, and Toyota who've all been leading in this space. I'll give you a couple of examples, though, of what some of our members are doing. So take New York City, for example, which, as we all know, is a very dense urban environment, a lot of moving pieces in a New York City environment. They're actually deploying all aspects of V2X. So they're testing V2V, V2I, and V2P. Within V2V, they're actually testing forward crash warning, blind spot warnings, lane chain warnings, and a few more applications, all of which have the potential to dramatically improve safety for drivers. On the V2I front, they are working on applications, or deploying, applications that alert drivers approaching work zones, school zones, warn a driver if they're going to run a red light, and can share emergency or evacuation information from key city departments or even the National Weather Service. And then on the V2P front, which I will just add that right now we know that vulnerable road user deaths are rising on our roadways, so this is very important. They are testing applications that help improve crosswalk safety for pedestrians. So these are all very relevant to some of the challenges that we see on our roads today. I'm going to give you one more example of a very different environment, and that's in Wyoming on I-80. So I-80 is a freight corridor, a major east to west freight corridor. Obviously, the weather and the conditions are very different in Wyoming than in New York City. In Wyoming, we've seen that during the winter, when wind speeds and wind gusts are raised and exceed 30 miles per hour and 65 miles per hour, respectively, crash rates on I-80 have been 3 to 5 times higher than in the summer. And this has resulted in about 200 truck blowovers within 4 years, which can lead to road closures. So of course you've got safety, but you've also got a significant impact if the road has to be closed because it's a major east to west corridor. So in Wyoming, they have deployed V2I situational awareness, work zone warnings, distress notifications, weather and spot weather impact warnings. And these are really important because it's being used to mitigate the effects of icy road conditions. I think probably we've all seen, unfortunately, the images of massive truck pileups on some of these rural roads, and ice and weather can be a significant contributor or catalyst to those crashes, But this technology is demonstrating how if they can get these warnings to the drivers in advance time through this technology, that they then have an ample time to slow down and to avert a crash. So that's just a couple of examples of how our members are actually deploying this technology in the real world today.
Boy, those are great safety examples. Thanks for sharing that. As you know, the FCC has shrunk the spectrum to only 30 megahertz. And in our earlier segments, we discussed the NHTSA research on interference and the impact on V2X communication. Can you speak about the impact? And my question will be a two-pronged question here. Can you speak about the impact that this has on some of your members? And also, can you speak to which options do you suggest pursuing to regain the viability of V2X, whether it's retrieving the lost bandwidth, or at least part of it, or moving the remaining channels to another part of the spectrum, or limiting interference from unlicensed Wi-Fi devices with a greater buffer, or ensuring the FCC enforces its rules regarding interference?
Sure. So first, I will say that we do have significant concerns about the impact of the FCC's decision. I do think it's important to mention here that the FCC is not a transportation safety expert, and they made this decision against the opposition of all the transportation safety experts, including US DOT, including 50 state DOTs, including all of the transportation experts in this community. So having said that, we have done an analysis of the remaining 30 megahertz to determine, what can fit and what can't, because there is a finite amount that can fit in the 60% less spectrum in the 30 megahertz that is remaining. So what we have found is that there are some V2X applications, such as sensor sharing, and cooperative maneuvering, such as collective merging, that would enhance safety of AVs that would be lost.
Laura, can you expand on the shared perception issue?
Sure. So V2X, one of the, I think, great advantages of V2X technology is it allows vehicles to see beyond their line of sight. So, for example, with AVs, with all of the technology, the LiDAR and other technology, they can see within their line of sight. Adding V2X to that allows them to see beyond that line of sight, which means that they could share information of, let's say, a biker coming around the corner, or something that they cannot, that a connected vehicle could not see, an AV could not see on its own. It can share that information with another vehicle. So it's really important. That's an advanced application that would not be possible within only 30 megahertz. But in terms of safety, it's extremely important for the safety benefits. In addition, we have determined that it's very likely that vehicle to pedestrian and vulnerable road user applications would be lost in the 30. So the impacts are I would say, devastating for safety. So we're going to continue to refine that analysis and test out the concepts. But that is one of those are some of the biggest impacts that we've seen from the 30. On the second part of your question, with regard to the viability of the remaining 30, we're engaging on several fronts. And I do want to make one distinction here for people who may not be quite as steeped in this matter. It's not just a matter of the FCC enforcing their rules. It's a matter of ensuring that the rules are sufficient to protect the spectrum from interference. And currently, they are not. So interference is one area where we are engaging heavily in terms of the remaining 30 megahertz. Right now, the proposed power limits that the FCC has, are, as I said, they are not sufficient. They will cause interference. There's research from Ford and others who've done testing that show that there will be interference. And as I mentioned before, the 30 does not leave room for all of the breadth of V2X safety applications. Another area that we are advocating on is reimbursement for stranded deployments in the lower 45. So, that there are deployments that are in that 45 megahertz that are going to need to be moved, and we support reimbursement for those. Another area is we are advocating for additional spectrum. We are asking the FCC to work with Department of Commerce and US DOT to identify suitable spectrum elsewhere for V2X deployment. We believe we need an additional 40 megahertz of low latency mid-band spectrum in order to support V2X applications. And then finally, two other areas that we're working on outside of the FCC specifically is we have a wide-ranging coalition of V2X stakeholders that we've been engaging with for a couple of years now. Beyond just our membership, this includes, law enforcement, includes many other, even consumer groups that are concerned about road safety. And we continue to work with them to ask Congress to intervene and offer appropriate protections for V2X technologies and the spectrum. And then finally, ITS America has joined with AASHTO, the group that represents the state DOTs, in appealing the FCC's decision in court. And we're awaiting the results of that legal action.
Thank you for that. I'm very well aware of that. And let's switch the conversation now, and let's discuss the basic viability of V2X in the US. Are there any global agreements regarding V2X, or do different regions pursue deployment independently?
So different regions are taking their own approaches to designating spectrum, but there are two things that are in common among all regions. First is that they utilize the 5.9 gigahertz band. And the second is that they're all increasing the amount of spectrum allocated for V2X, not decreasing it. So, for example, our North American partners, so Mexico and Canada, they both have 75 megahertz allocated around the world. I know Europe has 50 megahertz. Singapore has 50 megahertz. Australia has 70 megahertz, and on and on. China, which is a big competitor, obviously, to the US, they're taking a phased approach. So they have allocated currently 20 megahertz in the 5.9 band for deployment of C-V2X technology. In China, C-V2X is expected to be included on half of all new car sales by 2025. So the approach they're taking is saying they can deploy the day one basic safety message applications in the 20, but they're currently, at the same time, they are studying the need for additional spectrum. So, they're moving on two fronts. I will also say that they have made a decision to allow deployment of 4G LTE C-V2X now in the current spectrum, with the expectation that they would be allocating additional spectrum for 5G C-V2X. So China's not going to have the same challenges that we face here when it comes to allocating additional spectrum for V2X communications.
Very interesting. At the end of
add one more thing to that.
Sure, absolutely, please.
I want to add one more point here, which is, and this was actually something that that US DOT had mentioned in their comments, and we strongly agree with. And this is to kind of put the global landscape into some context. So the real problem here is that the FCC's decision has set up a situation where vehicles can reach their full safety potential in neighboring countries, but then must downgrade their protections when they enter the United States. Clearly, this is problematic for safety. I don't have to explain why. It's also problematic for global competitiveness, and for U.S. automakers who we don't want to be in a position of having to design for certain safety standards here in the U.S. and then be outcompeted globally because their safety standards are not designed, for a more robust spectrum environment in Europe and otherwise. So, although we have, as the U.S., we have led in the creation of these technologies and standards, right now, we are concerned that this proposal from the FCC will really cede American leadership in the space and really harm our global competitiveness.
Very good point. Thank you for sharing that. At the end of 2018, DOT issued an RFC seeking comments regarding communication technology, specifically whether the upcoming cellular-based technology should be preferred over the DSRC. Since then, the automobile industry has been divided over the issue, which also contributed to the lack of V2X deployment in the U.S. since 2017. Can you talk about the position of ITS America on this issue and discuss the build-out agreement for letting the industry market determine the best technology for V2X?
Yes, and here I will say that we strongly believe that the biggest contributor to a lack of deployment has been regulatory uncertainty caused by the FCC themselves. When the FCC commissioners send a letter to automakers essentially warning them not to deploy because the requisite spectrum may not be available, that has a chilling effect on deployments. So I think it's important to make sure that we recognize the history of what's happened. Having said that, ITS America is tech neutral. We have member companies who support both technologies for V2X, and we are united around the fact that the most important variable in this discussion right now is not which technology we use, but rather it is the spectrum going to be free from interference for V2X applications, and will we have enough spectrum for the breadth of V2X applications to truly make sure that we are using safety to its fullest extent. Our stakeholders, so our members who support both technologies, are in agreement that we need more than 30 megahertz. So that's a technologically neutral concern. And we did support the build-out agreement of the autos. And I will tell you about that in just 1 minute, but that build-out agreement was predicated on the need for 75 megahertz, and I'll explain why. So the build-out agreement had come from the auto industry collectively. They had committed to deploying at least 5 million V2X radios on vehicles and roadway infrastructure within 5 years. And they also came out at about the same time with a spectrum utilization agreement, which had been something the industry had really been working hard on, and really was a great, we think, a great compromise. The spectrum utilization agreement had indicated that C-V2X would get the upper 20 megahertz of the 75 megahertz band, DSRC would get the lower 20, and then the remaining 30 in the middle would be used for advanced applications of either technology. And after 5 years, there would be a determination of which technology was declared the winner, and then there would be a 10-year phase out for the losing vote technology. So now you can see why it really was predicated on the 75 megahertz, because you needed enough spectrum to truly allow each technology to flourish on its own without any kind of interference.
Okay. So with that being said, is the build-out agreement feasible today, considering that only 30 megahertz is remaining? And is there room for both DSRC and LTE V2X?
So I would say that the build-out agreement is not feasible with the 30 for some of the reasons I just mentioned. I will also add that with regard to both technologies, the FCC continues to create a lot of regulatory uncertainty around DSRC. So we don't believe that companies are going to invest in that when they don't have assurance that DSRC will be continually allowed to operate in the 30. So our focus as an association remains on trying to preserve the 30 megahertz, whatever spectrum that we have, to preserve that, make sure that it's usable, free from interference, and to advocate for additional spectrum elsewhere in the band so that we can actually realize the full potential of V2X technologies.
Great, thank you. So clearly 30 megahertz isn't enough for both LTE, V2X, and DSRC. Let's assume that the FCC's NPRM is adopted and finalized, and those 30 megahertz are allocated only for LTE V2X. Is there enough room for evolution of technology to 5G V2X? In other words, would 30 megahertz be enough for both LTE V2X and 5G V2X?
It's not, and that's because they're not compatible. And so you have a situation where it would not be tenable to all of a sudden turn off all the deployments from the LTE V2X and then turn on 5G. You need additional spectrum for evolution of the technology to 5G, which again goes to why we are advocating very strongly for an additional 40 megahertz of spectrum so that can be used for evolution of the technology to 5G. And I will add that we've called on the FCC to work with USDOT and to work with Department of Commerce and industry to identify additional spectrum that would be suitable for the future of V2X.
Great. You've spoken about the approaches that you and many of your members are taking to assist and steer the industry towards V2X deployment and to address the consequences of the FCC's actions this year. What about federal agencies? In your view, what action should the federal government be taking?
Well, we appreciate the support of agencies like NTSB and USDOT who have spoken out on the importance of V2X technologies. We do think it's really important that the FCC and USDOT work together to ensure that V2X spectrum is usable and that we find additional spectrum for the future of V2X. We will also continue to lead among our members to lead this conversation about what a 30 megahertz spectrum environment could look like, and we stand ready to work with USDOT and others to determine how can we get the most safety benefits from that 30 megahertz, and how can we best deploy V2X within that environment. And then finally, I will say that we have asked Congress and continue to ask Congress to ensure that the FCC provides spectrum that is free from interference, and usable for V2X applications, and to also look at whether an additional allocation of spectrum is necessary for the future V2X applications.
Great, thank you for that. I've asked you a lot of questions here today. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our discussion?
Well, I will. I'll add one thing, which is, as I mentioned, as we all know, traffic deaths are on the rise. They're going up even as vehicle miles traveled are going down. This affects all of us, right? So we've talked a lot about the technicalities of V2X in this conversation, which is very important, but there's a real human side to it too that affects every single one of us every day. So as a leader of an association who's focused on safety, and as a mother, I have twin boys who are about to get their driving permits. This is personal to me. It's personal to all of us. And so, to me, the status quo is unacceptable. 40,000 people dying on our roads every single year is unacceptable. And the reality is that we have a tool that we cannot leave on the sidelines. V2X has the potential to reduce 80% of non-impaired crashes. It is our best tool to save lives on our roadways. So I want to thank you for the conversation. I want to thank you for NTSB's acknowledgement of V2X as a critical safety technology. And thank you for everything you're doing to bring awareness to this issue, because ITS America intends to continue fighting to make sure that V2X technologies can be deployed and that we have protected spectrum so that in the end, we can protect all of our families and loved ones.
Thank you for that, Laura, and thank you for joining us today. I appreciate your insight and your comments on this important safety issue.
Thank you.
Recent actions by the FCC threatened the basic viability of V2X in the United States and all but eliminated the space for future evolution of the technology. While DOT and NHTSA have publicly opposed these actions, the FCC has nonetheless been making these transportation safety decisions that are having a severely negative impact on transportation safety. With two federal agencies on the opposite side of a transportation safety issue, DOT and NHTSA must lead and act for the benefit of transportation safety. This leadership is especially critical considering the industry divisions. Regulatory inaction and industry indecision has caused the United States to fall behind. Instead of leading the world in vehicle safety technology, we are regressing. While Europe and China are rapidly moving forward with broad V2X deployment, we are plagued by self-created problems. In our next episode, we will talk to AASHTO and Georgia DOT to hear the perspective from the state DOTs, which have been heavily investing in preparing the infrastructure for the arrival of V2X capable vehicles.